Hello and welcome to All Hands on Tech, where today's leaders talk tomorrow's technology. I'm Daniel Blazer. Since it's Election Day in the United States, today we're bringing you the audio from our recently released course, Securing the Vote, Everything You Need to Know About Election Security. With all the rumors and speculation surrounding this year's election, Pluralsight author Lyron Andrews covers the past, present, and future of election security. We encourage anyone following today's election to give this episode a listen and maybe share it with a friend.
Hi, my name is Lyron Andrews. Thank you for joining me in this course, Securing the Vote, Everything You Need to Know About Election Security. While the bulk of our discussion will glean principles from what has been called the American experiment, we will zoom out our focus on a global perspective towards the conclusion of our discussion. When we say election, what does that mean? An election of a local, state, or federal government official or representative is the outcome of voting by the government citizens. Therefore, before we can understand why there is need for election security, it would make sense to first understand the tenuous nature of voting in America from the annals of history in its official record. It is also important to note that confidence of the fairness of the electoral process is under a daily barrage of insinuation and outright false claims from what would have been shocking sources only a few years ago. It would be quite easy for a topic like this to be accused of wading into political waters. So to ensure that we steer clear of such paths, all of our references are from reputable, nonpartisan research institutions such as MIT. The bulk of the citations and references are directly from the founding documents known collectively as the Charters of Freedom that include the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. The documents frame the statements of a group of people seeking freedom from tyranny. Included will be the official policies from American agencies, including the USPS, United States Postal Service, Department of Homeland Security, and additional records accepted into the Library of Congress. We will investigate voting and electoral security from the standpoint of what has taken place in the past, what we face now in the present, and what we can look forward to in the future. In the United States, no one is required by law to vote in any local, state, or presidential elections. According to the United States Constitution, voting is a right and privilege. Many constitutional amendments have been ratified since the first election. However, none of them made voting mandatory for United States citizens. The first element of election security is ensuring that the citizens of said nation can actually vote. Let's examine the historical record and trajectory of who was initially granted voting rights. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed." But how would Americans consent to be governed? Who could vote and how? These questions presented challenges for the founders. They wondered about the rights of minorities. In their day, that meant wondering about the rights of property owners being overrun by votes of those who did not own land. James Madison described the problem this way: extending voting rights equally to all and the rights of property owners may be overruled by a majority without the property. The formers of the Constitution left details of voting to the states. In Article 1, Section 4, the Constitution says, "The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations." Leaving voting practices to the states ensured that rights were uniformly defined for white men only. Yet African Americans, women, indigenous peoples, non-English speakers, and citizens between the ages of 18 and 21 had to fight for the right to vote in the United States. Perhaps you'll find it helpful to look at the history of voting rights on a timeline. In 1776, you'll find the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. On September 30th, 1778, Pennsylvania became the first state to elect its 2 United States senators. January 7th, 1789, George Washington was elected President of the United States. The first Speaker of the House was elected April 1st, 1789. The authority to amend the Constitution of the United States is derived from Article 5 of the Constitution. The Constitution provides that an amendment may be proposed either by the Congress with a 2/3 majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, or by a constitutional convention called for by 2/3 of the state legislatures. The first 10 amendments became known as the Bill of Rights, which includes many of the freedoms we associate so closely with the United States, such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. These constitutional rights protect the lives of individuals from interference by the government. The 13th Amendment of 1865 abolished slavery. The 15th Amendment was added in 1870 to the United States Constitution and granted African American men the right to vote, declaring that the right to vote in the United States, the vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state or on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Although ratified on February 3, 1870, the promise of the 15th Amendment would not be fully realized for almost a century. Through the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, and deadly violence, Southern states were able to effectively disenfranchise African Americans. It would take the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 some 100 years later before the majority of African Americans in the South were registered to vote. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, gave American women the right to vote. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, eliminated poll taxes. The tax had been used in some states to keep African Americans from voting in federal elections. The 26th Amendment, ratified in 1971, lowered the voting age for all elections to 18. Federal laws passed over the years help protect Americans' right to vote and make it easier for citizens to exercise that right. The Civil Rights Acts created some of the earliest federal protections against discrimination in voting. These protections were first outlined by the Civil Rights Act of 1870 and were later amended by the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was propelled by advocacy groups like the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, as well as Dwight D. Eisenhower administration. Congress also took up the issue of civil rights during the summer of 1957. This is an hour for great moral stamina. Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr. of New York, one of 3 African Americans in the first session of the 85th Congress, told his colleagues. 1960 found the Civil Rights Act, which was intended to strengthen voting rights and expand the enforcement powers of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It included provisions for federal inspection of local voter registration rolls and authorized court-appointed referees to help African Americans register and vote in dangerous places. It also provided criminal penalties for anyone attempting to prevent people from voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited voter discrimination based off of race, color, or membership in a language minority group. It also required certain places to provide election materials in languages besides English. Voting accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of 1984 required polling places to be accessible to people with disabilities. The Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act of 1986 addressed overseas U.S. voters to be able to register and vote by mail. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993 created new ways to register to vote. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 authorized federal funds for elections. It also created the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. The EAC helped states comply with the HAVA to adopt minimum standards on voter education, registration, and ballots. Military and Overseas Voting Improvement Act, or MOVE, improved access to voting by military and overseas voters in 2009. The past was spent getting their house in order in the United States to really make it possible for every citizen to vote and for every vote to count. Let's now move toward the present. So far, we've discussed security from the standpoint of those doing the electing. For a moment, do you care to entertain another question? What does security look like from the standpoint of the one elected? The fear of foreign interference was a driving issue in the conversations of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Several features of the Constitution that the framers produced that summer had their origins in this fear. The founders created guardrails in the Constitution like the following. First, the president has to be a natural-born citizen. Second, the Emoluments Clause, prohibiting any government officer from accepting a title or a gift from any foreign government, which surfaced in the form of two separate lawsuits allowed to go forward by two different federal judges alleging violation of that clause by the president in office in 2020. Both courts accepted the definition of emolument as any profit, gain, or advantage. Third, the framers developed the impeachment clause. As originally written, it singled out the crimes of treason and bribery as grounds for impeachment. The phrase high crimes and misdemeanors was added late in the convention process at the urging of Virginia Delegate George Mason, who thought naming just two crimes too restrictive. Amazingly, there is no additional specificity than this for the one holding the highest office in the United States. Almost everything else is left to an expectation of decorum and decency by the one elected to the highest office in the United States. It is possible to make a basic account of security by enumerating three main categories: physical, technical, and administrative. These could be tied in with the triad of control known as confidentiality, integrity, and availability. For each of these, there is considerable work that needs to be done in order to create a high level of assurance. For physical, think about the building systems, the location of the building, the ability to lock up physical spaces and protect physical data like ballot boxes and mail-in voting. For technical, think of any digital storage use and transfer of voting information. For administrative, think about directives, laws, regulations, and processes. First, we will describe the administrative controls related to election security. To protect election security, federal election crimes fall into three broad categories: There is campaign finance crimes, such as when candidates accept funds that violate the amounts or donors permitted under the law. Civil rights violations involving voter intimidation, coercion, threats, and other tactics to suppress a person's ability to vote. The impetus of this arose with multiple people being killed in the 1960s who were simply exercising their right in assisting others to vote or to vote themselves. Voter fraud and voter registration fraud, such as when someone illegally casts a vote in the name of a dead person or someone who's moved. An additional control that we could add to the administrative section of election security is the Election Infrastructure Assessment Tool, or EIAT, developed by the Center for Internet Security, or CIS. CIS is a leading, highly reputable, and extensively used best practices platform for protecting cyber resources around the world. The tool describes how to apply 88 recommended IT best practices to each aspect of the election environment. The EIAT is tailored to address voter registration, election management systems, election night results reporting, poll books, vote capture devices, vote tabulation devices. The EIT is free for election officials, is structured for use by local election officials as part of a management control plan or by IT administrators. The tool reflects the need for jurisdictions to implement a methodological approach to prepare for today's modern election environment. With correct permissions, the EIAT allows state-level jurisdictions to view the results of localities in its states. The tool has a 6-step assessment process that includes 1. Engaging stakeholders, 2. Gathering information and completing an assessment, 3. Reviewing results, 4. Making a plan for remediation, 5. Following the plan for remediation, and 6. Repeat. A final control we could add to the administrative group is the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Services Catalog for Election Infrastructure. The Homeland Security Act established the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 and made the Department of Homeland Security responsible for safeguarding our nation's critical infrastructure from physical and cyber threats that can affect national security, public safety, and economic prosperity. The catalog lists and describes cybersecurity services available to the election community. The purpose of the catalog is to inform the election community of these services, advance information sharing among the community, and promote the protection of election systems. All services featured in this catalog are voluntary, non-binding, no cost, and available to stakeholders upon request. In August of 2020, the top counterintelligence official in the U.S. government warned of ongoing interference and influence efforts by China, Russia, and Iran. William Ivanina, who leads the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, said that the U.S. government has assessed that China prefers President Trump losing the election because Beijing considers him unpredictable, while Russia is working to undermine Democrat Joe Biden. Mr. Ivanina continues, and I quote, "Ahead of the 2020 U.S. elections, foreign states will continue to use covert and overt influence measures in their attempts to sway United States voters' preferences and perspectives, shift U.S. policy, increase discord in the United States, and undermine the American people's confidence in our democratic process." Unquote. The 2016 Russian cyber attacks exposed glaring vulnerabilities in U.S. voting systems. Hackers conducted research and reconnaissance against election networks in all 50 states, breached at least one state's registration database, attacked local election boards and infected the computers at a voting technology company. The Brennan Center for Justice states, most states' electronic voting and tabulation systems are at least a decade old, and many are no longer even manufactured. Election officials report that they must go to eBay to find replacement parts, which in itself poses a security threat. Registration databases are similarly antiquated, frequently running on unsupported software, which may not receive regular security patches and may be most vulnerable to the latest methods of cyber attacks. Recall that step 2 of the EIAT from CIS is gather information and complete the assessment. The EIAT classifies best practices based on the class of technology connectedness. These classes consist of network connected, indirectly connected, and transmission. Network connected would include all local area networks to and from the internet. Indirectly connected would include all of those networks that would be part of thumb drives and other secondary storage devices. The directly connected would be transmission. For transmission could obviously be on a local network, but this would also specify to and from the internet. You should first assess your inventory of systems and devices, including those dedicated to the election process, to determine which network connected class they fall into. Use the EIAT to review each of the best practices to find out if the best practice is implemented, has policy defined, or perhaps is not applicable. Another set of protection tools for cyber hygiene can be gleaned from the Department of Homeland Security Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, or CS&C. The Stakeholder Engagement and Cyber Infrastructure Resilience Division, and the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. They all actively engage stakeholders to prepare for, prevent, and respond to catastrophic incidents that could degrade or overwhelm these strategic assets. These stakeholders include state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. As a final technology tool from DHS, you could also implement the Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool, or CSET. It is a no-cost voluntary desktop standalone application that guides asset owners and operators through a systemic process to evaluate their operational technology and information technology network security practices. It is in this way, by applying standards and best practice recommendations in a systemic, disciplined, and repeatable manner, that the technology of the election can be protected. The FBI's official statement in August 2020 was, "We assess that Russia is likely to continue amplifying criticisms of vote by mail and shifting voting processes amidst the COVID-19 pandemic to undermine public trust in the electoral process." Availability is one of the 3 key elements of the security triad. Beyond external national threats, we must name a basic elephant-sized caveat to the efficacy of voting by mail that exists at the filming of this clip. In June 2020, a determined effort began to reduce 678 sorters and related equipment at the United States Postal Service. Some of these machines have a capacity to sort up to 30,000 pieces of mail with just 2 people, where it would take 30 people to do the same job manually. Although these removals did not continue in August, most states report being woefully underfunded to support vote by mail to a tune of $3.4 billion. Since much of the American population is planning to vote by mail in 2020, it will take the best efforts and working together as a nation for this to not have a substantive impact on the participation of voters. First, let's discuss the availability of vote by mail in recent evolution, like the past 4 to 7 years. The Pew Research Center records that 7 in 10 adults in the U.S. favor vote by mail. 97% of voters in Oregon and Washington conducted their elections almost entirely by mail-in ballots in 2016. Across the 5 states where the 2020 presidential election will be conducted entirely by mail, nearly 9 in 10 voters cast ballots using this method in 2016. In 29 states, as well as the District of Columbia, voters have the option to cast a ballot by mail without needing to document an excuse. In these states, roughly 1 in 5 voters cast a mail-in ballot in 2016. In 16 other states, an excuse is required to vote absentee, but 11 of these states have already announced changes to eligibility requirements amid coronavirus fears. Mail-in voting deadlines vary by state. Some states have a rule that specifies the mail must be postmarked by Election Day, while other states specify that you must have the vote in by the Election Day. Please use the following link to know what your state says. Knowing this is crucial to your vote counting. In 2016, 33.3 million ballots were mailed in. 73,565 were rejected due to being late. It is recommended that you submit your ballot at least 1 week prior to any deadline. Do it earlier, if at all possible. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, has an assessment tool and controls related to vote-by-mail security. It notes that risk to mail-in voting can be managed through various policies, procedures, and controls. Note the sensitivity of confidentiality, integrity, and availability practices that need to be maintained throughout the full life cycle of the voting by mail process, or VBM. Voter registration and mail ballot application processing collects data used to determine voter eligibility. The type of ballot a voter receives, the location or address for mailing the ballot of the voter, could be used as sensitive information and used to possibly attack the voter. Ballot printing. Almost all election jurisdictions use a ballot printer to print their ballots. Election officials send ballot printers electronic copies of ballot files for printing. Without properly implementing security controls, the transmission of ballot files can be at risk to a person-in-the-middle attack. Ballot package assembly. The ballot package assembly process matches a voter to a ballot. There is a risk to assembling incorrect voter to ballot information. The ballot delivery. Ballots will be delivered as official election mail if jurisdictions coordinate with the United States Postal Service to ensure their ballot packages are compliant with election mail standards. Additionally, an integrity or availability attack to divert or slow delivery of mail ballots could impact voters' ability to return ballots on time to ensure they are counted. Inbound is comprised of receiving a voted ballot from a voter, as well as authenticating a voter to determine if their ballot will be accepted for tabulation. Ballots may be received weeks before Election Day until days after Election Day, depending on the state law. Election jurisdictions must have physical processing control and the processing of ballots, allowing election officials to authenticate voters, accept or reject ballot packages. Chain of custody processes are crucial to tracking the amount and storage location of received ballots. Have you heard the largely circulated, unsubstantiated claim that vote by mail greatly increases fraud? The MIT Election Science Lab reports the following. Another question surrounding VBM is whether it increases voter fraud. There are two major features of VBM that raise these concerns. First, the ballot is cast outside the public eye, and thus the opportunities for coercion and voter impersonation are greater. Second, the transmission path for VBM ballots is not as secure as traditional in-person ballots. These concerns both relate to being intercepted and ballots being requested without the voter's permission. As with all forms of voter fraud, documented instances of fraud related to vote by mail are rare. In 2013, Colorado became the fourth state to do universal vote by mail. 99.3% of votes in the 2020 primary were returned by mail. Election envelopes must be signed. A bipartisan team of FBI-trained handwriting analysts then compare those signatures to those stored on file. If the signature does not match, it is investigated by the district attorney's office. The Conservative Heritage Foundation found 9 instances of voter fraud out of 16 million votes received in between 2013 and 2020. Reporting on this, George Stern, an elections administrator for Jefferson, Colorado, the 4th largest voting district there, says this is literally less than 1 out of a million. George continues, paper ballots equals a paper trail. That paper trail is stored for 2 years after the election. The voting equipment is never connected to the internet, never has been, never will be. Counting equipment is never connected to the internet. Voting results are delivered more rapidly than in person. Another spurious and mythological claim is that Democrats are favored over Republicans when it comes to mail-in voting. In 2014, the first general election that Colorado had, they actually overturned all of the seats so that they had a majority Republican legislature. They won a majority in the state Senate and won 3 out of 4 statewide offices. As a voter, United States Postal Service has a frequently asked questions page to answer basic questions on their website related to receiving your vote. A number of different mobile voting prototypes have been attempted over the past 8 years as a number of states have experimented with allowing overseas military personnel and civilians to vote while abroad. Most of these, unfortunately, have been unsuccessful. As an example, Delaware election officials nixed a plan to offer an online ballot return method to voters in its presidential primary in July 2020, citing a report from security experts that found that the platform is vulnerable to voter manipulation and numerous security vulnerabilities, including potential denial of service attacks, malware intrusions, and privacy violations. Before the online option was shuttered, voters returned more than 2,700 ballots electronically, and those votes still will be counted, according to the officials, along with conventional votes in their upcoming July primary. In February of 2020, Washington State carried out a live mobile voting pilot in an obscure ballot that was held to elect the Board of Supervisors of the King Conservation District, a resource management organization operating under state authority. Out of 1.2 million registered voters that could participate, 6,280 turned in a ballot. 5,921 of those did it electronically. The first item that the voter was presented with was the comparison chart that enumerated how different this mobile election process was from the Democratic Iowa caucus's failure the week before. For instance, the Iowa caucus's goal for using mobile voting software was to make the tabulation easier for the officials. whereas the goal in Washington state was to increase voter turnout. They increased turnout by over 90%. The technology used in the Iowa caucuses was new, untested, and was vetted in secrecy. In Washington state, it was done completely transparently and done by means of multiple prototypes. The Iowa caucus had the state party roll out the software without getting input from stakeholders. Washington hosted multiple pilots beforehand. Iowa had no backup plan. Washington employed a paper trail. February 2020, in Fulton Township, Wisconsin, a place located about a half-hour drive from Madison, with a population of 3,300, had this wonderful teaming up of Microsoft and the local election officials to accommodate 400 voters who traveled through the snow to cast their electronic ballot on a fully electronic system. The system runs on a Microsoft service called Election Guard. It utilizes homomorphic encryption, which is encryption that allows for calculations to be performed on encrypted data without first decrypting it. The output is the same as if it were performed on unencrypted data. A paper ballot was generated for each vote and hand counted at the end to ensure the system's accuracy. When the election guard and the paper count results matched up exactly, Microsoft executives, poll workers, and the town's election officials all cheered because of the success. The Microsoft open source software is available for use and scrutiny on GitHub. You heard it right. I said Microsoft and open source in the same sentence. Microsoft said the software will work with any voting system, which can vary widely across the country as long as there is an electronic element. In this case, it worked with the VotingWorks platform. For Microsoft, Election Guard is not meant to be a commercial endeavor. It is a direct response to the threat imposed by election meddling by the Russians in 2016. This is a step that we're taking free of charge. We're not going to make revenue from this at all. The whole point is, what can we do as a company to help defend our democracy and protect the vote, says their executive. What theme did you pick up in the successful Washington State and Wisconsin story that resurfaces in like stories around the globe that are successful? Be sure to include all stakeholders in the information gathering phase. Don't impose new technology upon unsuspecting participants without providing proper training. Testing and small level implementation and prototyping is imperative. It's important that the technology be viewed as something that is going to fail. Not if, but when. Once it is understood that failure is inevitable, then the realities of planning for contingency are able to be imagined, planned, and implemented. The American Association for the Advancement of Science's Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues has written an open letter to the United States governors, secretaries of state, and state election directors to express concern about the security of voting via the internet or mobile apps. The AAAS letter has been signed by renowned cybersecurity and computing experts and organizations. It reflects research from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine and National Institute of Standards and Technology and other organizations. They say, at this time, electronic voting is not a secure solution for voting in the United States, nor will it be in the foreseeable future. The letter reads, pointing to undetected manipulation of votes, privacy violations, malware intrusions, and the potential for denial of service attacks and other vulnerabilities. What is the real threat to any type of voting, no matter if it is a paper ballot or electronic? The number of those getting their news from social media platforms is gradually outpacing other traditional news sources. A Pew survey in 2019 showed that 8% of the respondents got their news from the radio, 13% from network TV, 16% from local TV, 16% from cable TV, 25% from news websites, and 18% from social media. There may be an even greater imperative to ponder what is in the way and what will impede free and fair elections and election security. Unless you've been completely off the grid, would it be possible for you to not notice the world of post-truth that infects an element of every substantive social platform out there? Research has shown that once inside an echo chamber on one of these social platforms, the captured participant is less knowledgeable and less engaged than others. They are only interested in hearing from and speaking to those of their own tribe, and it becomes a breeding ground where lies masquerade as truth, innuendo masquerades as fact, and fanciful conjecture masquerades as science. At Davos, Switzerland in 2018, Yuval Harari spelled out the potential consequences of an algorithmic world. He acknowledged the huge benefits of the digital age, but forewarned of a scenario in which human beings acquire the potential to hack into the bodies, minds, and brains of other human beings. The algorithm learning the individual better than the individual knows themselves. Now, before you dismiss this as scientific drivel, first note that this is already being accomplished at great success without having a Westworld-like digital connection to your brain. Facebook's news feed, for instance, runs on an algorithm that promotes whatever content wins the most engagement. Studies find that negative primal emotions actually draw greater engagement. Tribalism, a universal human tendency, also draws heavy engagement. Posts that affirm your group identity by attacking another group tend to perform well. Finally, social media platforms use color and sound to reward engagement, which humans naturally seek out. Comments and likes are presented like a set of diamonds clicking into place on a slot machine. It delivers a little dopamine boost, training you to repeat whatever behavior wins the most engagement. Nations seeking to create instabilities beyond another nation's borders will amplify and create additional robotic divisions. And it is becoming more difficult to arrive at a sense of truth when artificial intelligence-infused deepfake materials may begin to outpace the veracity tools that confirm they are not real. Maybe the most important question of all is, does the boundarylessness of the modern world, as related to digital phenomenon, preclude us living in a Westphalian future? Westphalia is an area of northwestern Germany that was the location of a treaty signing in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in the history of Europe, when the Austrian Habsburgs tried to impose Roman Catholicism on their Protestant subjects in Bohemia. It pitted Protestant against Protestant, Protestant against Catholic, the Roman Empire against France, the German princes and the princelings against the emperor and each other, and France against the Habsburgs of Spain. The Swedes, the Danes, the Poles, the Russians, the Dutch, and the Swiss were all dragged in and divided. Commercial interest and rivalries played a part, as did religion and power and politics. The wars were largely fought on German soil and created an epidemic of constant starvation, cannibalism, rape, and pillaging. Scholars and historians argue about how much the Westphalia Treaty directly impacts what are known as principles of Westphalian sovereignty, but we won't argue that here. What is important is to know what these principles are and to be concerned about how quickly they are eroding what is tenuously holding global society together today. They are, namely, 1, the principle of international law that each nation-state has sovereignty over its territory and domestic affairs to the exclusion of external powers and non-interference in their domestic affairs. And 2, that every nation under national law is equal. These lines are being blurred in the cyber age. What we choose to do can help those lines be retained and help us to have a better future when it comes to voting in democratized nations.
Thank you for listening to All Hands on Tech. In the show notes for today's episode, you'll find a link to Lyron's Pluralsight author page, as well as the free course from which today's audio was taken.